Well, my guess is that you didn't have much of a problem with last week's sermon. In an anti-authoritarian culture that we live in, it's just not that difficult for us to hear a message about the downfall of Saul. No. Actually, for better or for worse, it's entertaining watching authority figures, and particularly corrupt authority figures, fall from power, isn't it? Exposing corrupt leaders is the stuff of Hollywood movie scripts and New York Times best-selling books. You also probably didn't have a problem when we applied Saul's authority to things like approval or greed. You might have felt a little bit uncomfortable like I did, but honestly, addressing those desires, well, it's kind of in vogue to poke holes at approval and greed and show about how they're bad for our mental health. Pastors just don't usually get fired when they talk about the dangers of money. At least my family and I hope that pastors don't get fired when they talk about the dangers of money, because that's what we talked about last week. But the reality is you and I just don't find it all that difficult to get behind a narrative that tells us to reject the modern Sauls, the corrupt authority, the corrupt idols in our lives. We just don't find much problem with that. But the mood changes when we're told to submit to someone else, right? We don't like that as much. That's not as fun. It feels restrictive, like a scratchy turtleneck or an uptight HOA. I mean, with money and approval off the throne, we were maybe thinking about sitting up there ourselves. Take control of our own life. Be our own boss. It's a dream as old as Adam and Eve. But even with all of those sinful, anti-authoritarian impulses passed down from Adam, I believe that we have deep down a more compelling dream that drives us. Because we are made in the image of God, I believe that deep down we have a deeper, more compelling dream to submit to the good authority of God. I think it's why we obsess over political figures and generational athletes. Contrary to what our sinful impulses tell us, we want to follow someone greater than ourselves. Someone not made in our image. Someone made in an otherworldly image. Someone made in God's image. And in 1 Samuel chapter 16 through 17 this morning, we're going to see that Samuel, the prophet Samuel, believes the same thing. It's why he talks about David's rise to power and his battle with Goliath the way that he does. Even if you're new to church, you've probably heard about David's battle with Goliath. And you've probably heard about how if you'll just trust God, he can be able to deliver you from less than ideal circumstances. If you trust God, he can help you do great things. Which is super inspiring for guys like me who are 5'9" and played homeschool basketball. That narrative can really put a pep in your step. Or maybe you've read one of my favorite sociologists, Malcolm Gladwell, in his book, David and Goliath, where he makes the case that the story of David and Goliath is not really a story about an underdog getting an upset. No, Gladwell says that it's a story about how David strategically used the resources that he had and turned a traditional hand-to-hand combat fight into a projectile battle. And how we should, like David, creatively use the resources, the limited resources that we have to be able to do well in life. But with both of these interpretations, the focus is on the same person, isn't it? The focus is the same. It's on us and how we are like David. And if you've been with us through our series through 1 Samuel, you'll know that's not the focus of the book, is it? And it doesn't follow the thesis of the book that we heard back in chapter 2. As any English lit teacher would tell you, we should never forget about the thesis of a book when trying to interpret the rest of the book, right? If you do that, you'll come up with all sorts of wacky ideas and wrong applications. So we should consider the thesis of 1 Samuel before moving on into the story of David and Goliath. But it's been a while since we were back in chapter 2 and we heard Samuel's mom's prayer. So to refresh your memory, here's the thesis of the book that we looked at a while back. Here's Hannah's main point in chapter 2, verses 1 through 10. God will weaken the strong through judgment, and he will strengthen the weak through salvation. Say it again. Hannah's main point in her prayer in chapter 2, verses 1 through 10, which is the thesis of the book of Samuel, is that God will weaken the strong through judgment, and he will strengthen the weak through salvation. We've seen how this prophetic theme has just played out throughout the book, haven't we? It's just flavored and shaped the whole book. But as King David comes on the scene today, I want to more specifically jog our memories how Hannah opened her prayer and how she closed her prayer. So in 1 Samuel chapter 2, I'll read verses 1 and 10, the very beginning and the very end of Hannah's prayer. And Hannah prayed and said in verse 1, "My heart exults in the Lord. My horn is exalted in the Lord. My mouth derides my enemies because I rejoice in your salvation." And skipping over to the end of her prayer in verse 10, she concludes, "The adversaries of the Lord shall be broken to pieces. Against them he will thunder in heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed." Do you see in both verses 1 and 10, the introduction and conclusion of her prayer, how the image of a horn is highlighted and how it's repeated? Like we talked about a while ago, the image of a horn in the Old Testament was a symbol of strength, a symbol of salvation. And so, when Hannah speaks of God exalting her horn in verse 1, and God exalting the king's horn in verse 10, it's like she's saying God's going to use the king's horn to break the adversaries of the Lord into pieces. And when the king does that, when he breaks the adversaries of the Lord, he will secure salvation for God's people. He will secure salvation for Hannah. God's people, well, we don't need to be the heroes of the story. No, God is going to raise up a hero for us. This is where Hannah is looking to in chapter 2, verses 1 and 10. This is the thesis of the book, which creates this tension early on in the book. The tension is this: when will the people get this hero king? That's what drives the narrative of Samuel. When will God's people get the hero king who break the neck of the adversaries of the Lord? When will this good king's good authority bring blessing to God's people? Well, from chapter 8 through chapter 15, we saw what happened when Israel demanded a king in their image. We saw that last week with Saul. It was a hot mess, wasn't it? It didn't turn out well for God's people when they wanted a king in their own image. You know, Saul's insecurity and selfishness led to all sorts of foolish decision-making, disobedience, oppressive leadership. In chapter 15, God tells Saul, his days as king are coming to an end. And not only that, in verse 29, he tells him that he's got another guy in mind who's better than Saul. It's rough, but it's true. It's true, and it sets us up for a king that God wants in 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 1. Chapter 16, verse 1, the Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you grieve over Saul, since I have rejected him from being king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided for myself a king among his sons." The contrast between Saul's installation and David's installation as king is striking, isn't it? If you remember back to chapter 8 verse 22, in chapter 8, verse 22, God tells Samuel, obey their voice, being Israel's voice. Obey their voice and provide them a king. But here, God tells Samuel what? Obey my voice. Obey my voice. I've provided myself a king. And with that contrast, the fight is set. In one corner, we have Saul, a king made in Israel's image. And in the other corner, we have a son from Jesse, a king that God is going to provide for himself, a king made in God's image. Who's going to win? A king in Israel's image or a king in God's image? Well, you know the answer, so I won't pretend to drum up any drama here. We know the answer. It's going to be God's king, right? It's going to be a clear victory. I mean, God's king is just going to beat up Saul throughout this morning's message. First round knockout. So I won't pretend that there's any drama here. But as we see the contrast between Israel's king from back in chapters 8 through 15 and God's king in chapters 16 through 17, here's what I want us to focus in on. I've been praying that as we see the contrast between a king made in our image and a king made in God's image, that God would create a deeper and deeper passion for submitting to the good authority of God's king. That God would give us, as first point, a passion for submission. Not a begrudging reluctance to obey God. Not because we have to, like submitting to God is just something that we've got to check off. But that as we see the good authority of God's king, that we would run underneath his authority and come in with deep passion to submit to him in all facets of our life. That's what I want for us as we see the difference between a king in our image and a king in God's image. So let's look at that. Let's see what kind of God or what kind of king God provides for himself in chapters 16 and 17. And then after we do that, we will see how God raises up and have an even better king than one of Jesse's sons. Well, first, in chapter 16, verses 1 through 5, we see that Samuel, like Darren read for us, Samuel obeys God, and when he shows up at Jesse's house looking for a king, Jesse parades his sons in front of Samuel the prophet. Verse 6, Eliab, he initially stands out as a good choice. He probably looks like, well, I won't embarrass some of you, but we all know who Eliab probably looks like. Some of you brothers out there, I'm looking at you right now, some of you brothers just look like a king. Tall, great hair. You didn't play homeschool basketball. No, you probably played on like a travel team called the Florida Elite or something cool like that. And if I had to pick a king from out of First Boynton, there are a couple of you guys that look like you would fit the bill as a good choice. Well, this is what Samuel thought of Eliab. He looked at him and he said, yeah, that looks like a king. What did he say? He says to himself, surely the Lord's anointed is before him. But in verse 7, God tells Samuel to hold his horses. He tells them, he says, do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. So Jesse pivots to his next oldest son, Abinadab, and he passes by, but he's not it either. You can see where this is going. Shammah comes by, and he's not the guy either, and Samuel doesn't even mention the other sons who get turned down. Which just begs the question, if these guys over here are not going to be the king, well then who is going to be the king? Glad you asked. Chapter 16, verses 11 through the beginning of verse 12. Then Samuel said to Jesse, are all your sons here? And he said, there remains yet the youngest. But behold, he is keeping the sheep. Samuel said to Jesse, send him and get him, for we will not sit down till he comes. And he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy and had beautiful eyes and was handsome. In verse 12, when it says that David was ruddy and had beautiful eyes and was handsome, that is not a compliment. No, this is the phrase, this is the description that Goliath is going to use in chapter 17 when he's taunting David. You could think about it like two brothers in a fight, and the older brother telling the younger brother that it's just cute when the younger brother tries to beat him up. Cute is not what the younger brother wants to hear, right? That is not a compliment. This is how David is being described here. It's definitely not a characteristic that you'd want for a king. But while David's not the king that Israel wanted, he is the king that God wanted. Verse 12b, second half of verse 12, and the Lord said, "Arise, anoint him, for this is he." David's the young man that was talked about back in chapter 13, verse 14, when Saul was told that God was seeking a man after his own heart. And so in verse 13 of our passage here in chapter 16, Samuel anoints David as Israel's impending king. Verse 13, then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers, and the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David from that day forward, and Samuel rose up and went to Ramah. We're not that far into chapter 16, but we can already see the different trajectories that Saul and David are on, can't we? At the Bible Project, they actually have this cool graph showing the rise and fall of Saul and David, the rise and fall of Saul and the rise and fall of David. And what's interesting is right at the point where Saul's reign comes down, when he's going down on his downfall, right here in the end of chapter 15, well, it's at the very beginning of chapter 16, our passage, that's when David's rise starts. It's just contrasting the two different kinds of reigns and the trajectory that Israel, a king in Israel's image is going to look like, and a king in God's image is going to look like. Two different trajectories. And this just continues to play out in the rest of the chapter as we read the second half of chapter 16, verses 14 through 23. And follow along. Now the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and a harmful spirit from the Lord tormented him. And Saul's servant said to him, "Behold now, a harmful spirit from God is tormenting you. Let our Lord now command your servants who are before you to seek out a man who is skillful in playing the lyre. And when the harmful spirit from God is upon you, he will play it, and you will be well." So Saul said to his servants, "Provide for me a man who can play well, and bring him to me." One of the young men answered, "Behold, I have seen a son of Jesse the Bethlehemite, who is skillful in playing, a man of valor, a man of war, prudent in speech, and a man of good presence. And the Lord is with him." Therefore Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, "Send me David, your son, who is with the sheep." And Jesse took a donkey laden with bread and a skin of wine and a young goat, and sent them by David his son to Saul. And David came to Saul and entered his service. And Saul loved him greatly, and he became his armor bearer. And Saul sent to Jesse, saying, "Let David remain in my service, for he has found favor in my sight." And whenever the harmful spirit from God was upon Saul, David took the lyre and played it with his hand. So Saul was refreshed and was well, and the harmful spirit departed from him. With the spirit departing from Saul and rushing onto David, we can see the difference between the two different kings, can't we? Saul's freaking out, experiencing the terrifying punishment from the Lord. David's just over here chilling, strumming his harp. The difference is so striking between the two kings. Saul uses David, David serves Saul. And in the backdrop of Saul's just spineless and confusing leadership that we saw back in chapters 18 through 15, well, here Saul's servants describe David as a man of valor, a man of war, and prudent in speech. If Saul's the guy at the baseball game who hides behind his girlfriend when the foul ball comes flying into the stands, David's the guy who's sitting next to the couple who shields both of them from getting hit. Which guy do you think Israel wants to go out with after that? Saul or David? The answer is obvious. It's clear who's going to be the better king. But if there's any trouble answering that question at the end of chapter 16, there's no doubt what the answer is going to be at the end of chapter 17. In the first few verses of chapter 17, the Israelites and the Philistines, they square off in a battle. Square off for control of a strategic plot of land, the Valley of Elah. You could think of the Valley of Elah as the front door to Israel's house. If you get through the Valley of Elah, you have access to Israel. You have access to their house. So it's a very important battle that Israel and Philistia are squaring off on. And to keep the Philistines from getting into Israel and ravaging their country and their homes, and their wives and their children, to keep all of that from happening, some brave Israelite was going to have to go up against the Philistines' greatest warrior, the champion. 9 foot, 6 inches plus, potty-mouthed Goliath. Chapter 17, verses 8 through 10. Goliath, he stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he's able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistine said, "I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we might fight together." Saul's, of course, terrified in verse 11. But in verses 12 through 16, David comes on the scene. And after he finishes his chores back at home, well, you get this kind of image of him just not being able to be kept away from the Israelite army. You get this sense that he's poised, that he's just ready to fight if given the chance. He just needs the opportunity. Well, he finally gets the chance when he takes some food to his brothers. When he comes and he brings his food to his brothers, David overhears Goliath mocking Israel, which he'd been doing for about 40 days. Been doing that for 40 days. And then after David hears about the reward for anyone who kills Goliath, he has, it's funny, and I'll just read it. 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 25. This is what he hears when he hears about Goliath mocking Israel. And the men of Israel said, "Have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches, and will give him his daughter and make his father's house free in Israel." David's shocked. He asks about the reward as if he didn't hear them right. Verse 26, "And David said to the men who stood by him, 'What shall be done for the man who kills the Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?'" I think that's kind of funny. David's essentially saying, did I hear you guys right? All you have to do is defeat this giant who's dishonored God. And if you defeat this giant who's dishonored God, then you get rich and you get the girl? Is that what Saul actually said? You could hear the bravado in David's voice as he's asking these questions, which David's oldest brother did not like. Eliab was not as much of a fan of David's bravado in verses 28 through 30, typical older brother. But when we think about how these are the first words that we hear from David in the Bible, these are the very first words that we hear from David in the Bible, you gotta love the moxie, don't you? Just quietly going about his business, bringing the food to his brothers. And then when he finally speaks, he's not cocky, but he's confident. You gotta love the moxie. Well, this confidence makes its way to Saul. And when David shows up, David speaks first. Verses 32 through 37. David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God." And David said, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." Notice the differences, again, between Saul's leadership and David's leadership. Well, Saul has just exemplified self-serving, selfish leadership. David's not worried about himself in verse 32. He's actually, what is he doing? He's trying to comfort the hearts of God's people. Back in chapter 9, before Samuel anoints Saul as king, what do we find Saul doing? Searching for his father's donkeys, not finding one of them. But before Samuel anointed David as king, David's wrestling bears and lions, delivering the sheep out of their mouths. Saul rejects the Lord, taking matters in his own hands. David honors the Lord, acknowledging the Lord's hand as the instrument for his future deliverance. David's clearly the king that should fight for God's people, which is what he does. After ditching behind Saul's clunky armor, David, what does he do? If we know the story, he picks up his pouch and his 5 smooth stones and his sling, and he faces Goliath on behalf of God's people. Verses 41 through 44. And the Philistine moved forward and came near to David with his shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field." Now, I know that some of y'all are super godly and maybe would do the same thing as David in a minute, but if I heard that, if a giant told me that he was going to feed my flesh to beasts, well, it'd be right about that point that I would be reevaluating my life plans. Maybe some of you can relate, be honest. I mean, at that point, retreating back to your father's house doesn't seem like that bad of an option. You can go back, watch a few sheep, marry a nice girl from Bethlehem, have a few little Davids running around your feet playing harps for you. I mean, that seems pretty attractive at that point. That's what I would be thinking of. Not David. No, David, he one-ups Goliath in verse 45. Then David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves, not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's. He will give you into our hand." Which is exactly what happens. Picking back up, verse 48, when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. David put his hand in his bag, took out a stone, and slung it, and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. Just like the Philistines' idol, Dagon, falling down before the ark of God, Goliath, the Philistines' champion, falls face down in front of the King of God. And like Dagon, Goliath loses his head in the process. This wouldn't be lost on an audience who knew their Old Testaments well, who knew the promise of Genesis 3:15, and how God was going to raise up a son from Eve to crush the head of evil. They would have remembered that and would have given them hope that God would raise up a deliverer to crush evil on their behalf. God doesn't need someone with a recognizable pedigree. In verses 55 through 58, when Saul questions whose son David is, I don't think he forgot who David was. He'd spent some time with David up to that point. I think what he's doing by asking him, whose son are you? He's highlighting the fact that David is coming from a family that no one knows about, from an unrecognizable family, and from a place in Bethlehem that no one cared about. From an unrecognizable family and an unrecognizable place. This is where David is coming from. He's just from the little town of Bethlehem. But like Hannah said would happen in chapter 2, verse 10, God exalts the horn of his anointed. And as God gives salvation to his king, he fulfills chapter 2, verse 1, exalting the horn of his people. And Israel derides their enemies, rejoicing in God's salvation. Back to verse 52. And the men of Israel and Judah rose with a shout and pursued the Philistines as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron, so that the wounded Philistines fell on the way from Shaaraim as far as Gath and Ekron. And the people of Israel came back from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their camp. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. Friends, church family, you and I cannot defeat our biggest problems. We can't. We can't pay off the guilt of our sin. We can't atone for all of the wrong things that we've done. We can't satisfy God's wrath. We can't be the hero of the story. But here's the good news. We don't need to be. No, King Jesus, he did pay the guilt of our sin. He did atone for our wrongdoings. He did satisfy God's wrath by drinking the cup on our behalf. He is the King that fights on behalf of us, God's people. We don't need to be the king. Jesus crushes the head of evil, making evil's face lie down in the dirt, and we can enjoy the benefits of God's King's victory on our behalf. As heroic as David was, David's character and his accomplishments, well, guys, they're just cheap knockoffs of Jesus's character and his accomplishments for us. That's who David is meant to make us look towards, not to ourselves, but to Jesus. Just think about how Jesus perfected what David anticipated. God was with David. Jesus was God. David was a man of prudent speech, speaking with carefulness, choosing his words with wisdom. Not too bad. John 7:47, even unbelievers said about Jesus that no one spoke like him. And before Jesus' battle on the cross, Jesus was perfectly composed during his trials. Well, Jesus is a master of words. There's no one who's spoken like him before, not even David. David was selflessly concerned about the hearts of the Israelite army. Impressive. But after Jesus tells Peter that Peter's going to deny him 3 times, do you remember what Jesus told Peter in the very next verse? Don't let your heart be troubled. I'm going to prepare a place for you in heaven, Peter. And what was Jesus doing on the cross? I mean, the greatest amount of suffering anyone could ever experience. The hardest battle anyone has gone into. And what was he doing on the cross? Well, he was taking care of his mom. Just concerned about her welfare. Jesus is the king of selfless leadership. No one has cared for people like Jesus has. David trusted God with Goliath's wrath, knowing that God could deliver him from the hands of the Philistine. But what did Jesus do? Well, he trusted his father with his father's wrath, drinking the cup of judgment our sin deserves, knowing God would deliver him from the fingers of death. Jesus is the leader who has obeyed in the hardest circumstances. You've never seen greater faithfulness like Jesus. David risked his life for his people, but Jesus gave his life for his people. Jesus uses his authority to sacrifice, not to take. You've never experienced sacrificial authority like him. I don't know what more you need to hear. What else do you need to hear? We've done everything to reject Jesus' good authority. And he's done everything to rescue us from our rebellion. His authority is universal and it is good. He is wise, he is in control, and he's working everything in your life for your good. Who needs Saul when you can have him? Who needs our idols when we can have Jesus? Who wants to reign in his place? I know that our sin doesn't like the idea of submitting to Jesus' authority, but I just firmly believe that there's something deep down inside of you that wants to submit to the authority that we've heard about in our passage and displayed in the person of Jesus. I just believe that deep down that's where who you want to submit to. God has planted that dream deep down inside our DNA. And if you will submit to the good authority of King Jesus, that dream can become true for you. The dream can turn into reality if you will submit your whole life to his authority. But here's the deal. We're going to have to submit to him when it doesn't seem like we should. That's the time when we're going to have to submit to him. When it doesn't seem like he's going to win the battle, when it doesn't seem like he's the brother that should get the crown, that's when we have to submit to him. When Jesus doesn't seem like he's the best option. When Eliab looks more appealing and Goliath seems like he's going to be the clear favorite, that's when we need to trust the Lord's perspective and not our own. For God sees not as we see. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart, and he knows what kind of authority will bless you. It will bless us. Submitting to King Jesus and confessing your sin won't always look attractive. No. The idea of holding on to your secret sin this morning, well, that probably looks like as compelling, as attractive as Eliab did to Samuel. But if you will trust Jesus and you will find a member after the service and you come to them with that secret sin, the blood of Jesus, the blood of King Jesus will cleanse your conscience. And that sin that you think will divide that friendship, that will ruin your relationships, when you confess your sin to another member, if you've done this, you know what I'm talking about, that friendship will only deepen. It will only grow if you will trust in Jesus' authority. It won't look like the right option at the time, but I promise you, if you bring that secret sin into the light this morning, it will bring you blessing. When sexual temptation is strong, self-gratification looks as strong as a giant. Self-restraint, well, it looks as compelling as a little shepherd boy. But what we don't know is that self-gratification ends up face down in the valley of Elah. I know this isn't easy, y'all. If you're not a Christian and you're here with us this morning, so glad you're here, by the way. Thankful for you. I'd love to meet you after the service. But if you're not a Christian, I think that I'm guessing is that Jesus, he probably looks like a good guy to you. Nice guy. A guy you wouldn't mind taking care of your sheep for a while. You know, someone to inspire you like David, teach you a few things maybe. But the idea of submitting to him as king of your life over every facet of your life, well, that feels a little bit too risky. Not realistic. I understand that. And even if you're a Christian, trusting Jesus with your suffering and trusting Jesus with your future can seem really, really scary. I mean, if you're really putting all on the line for Jesus as a Christian, it's going to make you do some things that make you feel really scared. And I understand that. But all that doubt, all that uncertainty, well, it's just forgetting how good God's king is with a sling and a stone. It's forgetting that it's God's king who will bring you victory. It's forgetting that submitting to Jesus will always bring you blessing. Every time. There's never a time where you submit to the authority of King Jesus and he doesn't give you blessing. Every single time we submit as individuals and as a church to the authority of King Jesus, he will bring us blessing. He is a good king, and he will use his reign to prosper us. It may not look like the prosperity that others would say we should look after, but he has a kind of prosperity for us that is much better. We just have to trust him. It's a good authority. It's an authority not just to reluctantly submit to, because we have to, but because we can. Because he has offered us the ability to submit to his reign. Oh, we should rush underneath that good authority. We should run hard to bow our knees to King Jesus. There's no reason to be reluctant when you have the opportunity to submit to that kind of king. So let's pray now. The Spirit would give us not a reluctant submission, but a passion for submission. You pray with me. Father, I pray that every impulse in us that doesn't want to submit to the good authority of your Son, King Jesus, I pray that your Spirit would root that out of our lives now. As we see our champion, our King, fighting on behalf of us, as we consider his selfless leadership, as we consider his love for us displayed on the cross, taking care of our greatest problem, our own sin, I pray that we would rush to the foot of the cross and bow before him, sacrificing whatever we need to, giving up whatever we need to for the sake of being able to follow him. We thank you for the King that you have provided in your Son, Jesus. We pray all these things in your Son's name. Amen.